What would you do if someone offered you a glass of mead made from a 600-year-old recipe? Yes, this really could happen today, and no, you don't need to be a time traveler. But if you are, let me know. There are two Gregorian monks that owe me money. The beverage I'm referring to is called a Bochet Mead. It was a late medieval French phenomenon, and we actually have a recipe for it from 1393. The history of the Bochet is a compelling story of medieval thrift, resourceful beekeeping, and how an entire modern brewing subculture has been accidentally born from a very specific translation choice in 2009. And yes, we're going to make it. But first, let's go back. Back to 14th century Paris. An older gentleman has just married a young woman, and she is now in charge of looking after him and his estate. The gentleman, wanting to both, I suppose, provide her with support and ensure her success, composes a compendium of information, instructions, and advice, entitled Le Ménagier de Paris, the Parisian household book. In this guide is a beverage recipe that makes use of caramelized honey, and it's referred to as a bochet. And so, in the smoky dimness of a 14th century cooking space, a young wife stands over a heavy iron cauldron, hanging from the hearth. She pours in raw honey, watching it carefully as the intense heat causes the liquid to aggressively expand and threaten to boil over. Lacking thermometers, she relies entirely on visual cues, waiting out the furious white froth until the rolling bubbles subside, black steam tendrils rise, and the skimmings turn a deep reddish brown. Pulling the heavy pot from the flames, she dilutes the darkened concentrate with 6 to 7 parts water, creating a light, crisp base meant for safe daily drinking. While the mixture is still warm, she strains it through a coarse cloth bag packed with a spice blend of ginger, long pepper, cloves, and citrusy grains of paradise. Once it cools, she brings the brew to life by stirring in barm, the active frothy top yeast skimmed from the neighboring ale vats. She lets the spice bag steep inside for just 2 to 3 days before removing it and sealing the liquid inside a dark wooden barrel. For about a month, the brew ferments in a cool pantry, giving the wild yeast time to convert the sugars and allowing the sharp spice profile to mellow out. When the barrel finally goes silent, she draws the deep amber, slightly cloudy elixir straight into clay pitchers, serving her household a sweet, aromatic, and deeply refreshing reward. This book wasn't a commercial brewing manual. It was an intimate domestic guidebook written by an elderly, wealthy Parisian to teach his young 15-year-old wife how to run the show. It was connected to an era in drink culture that, at this time, categorized Bochet as a regional lower to middle-class domestic everyday alternative to premium spice wines like Hippocras or Claret. This is the primary historical anchor for Bochet in academic literature, and the author has actually gifted us with one of the most interesting pieces of medieval food history and a recipe for what in recent years has become a viral mead in the home crafting world. It's important to note that there are 2 translations of this complex late medieval Old French. The first translation was in 1928 by British economic historian Eileen Power. Power translated the mead recipe accurately, but because homebrewing wasn't a mainstream digital subculture in 1928 like it is today, the recipe remained buried in academic history libraries for decades. The modern translation occurred in 2009 in The Good Wife's Guide by Gina L. Greco and Christine M. Rose. Greco and Rose chose to keep the untranslated Old French word bochet as the title of that specific recipe block because it had no equivalent in modern French cuisine. So when mead makers bought this updated text, they lifted the words straight out of the pages, permanently cementing bochet in the modern lexicon specifically as caramelized honey mead. This is the translation that sparked the massive modern craft brewing obsession with bochet. It was completely new, literal, and unabridged, and also a little controversial. In reaction to this revival, we have another interesting source, and I would say the most fulsome study on Bochet mead, and that is the pivotal work of independent scholar Susan Verberg. In 2020, she published a definitive paper that completely deconstructs our modern homebrewing assumptions about Bochet. Her primary argument? That the modern craft community suffers from confirmation bias, rooted entirely in that 2009 translation. Because the translators left the word Bochet untranslated, modern makers assumed it meant exclusively burnt honey mead. Verberg systematically proves that the history is far less rigid. And it actually all connects to how medieval beekeeping actually worked. So back then, bees were kept in woven straw baskets called skeps. Harvesting meant actually cutting out the comb. The first press yielded premium virgin honey, but the leftover wax combs still held a massive amount of residual honey. So to avoid waste, beekeepers crushed and washed these combs in warm water, creating a sweet, hazy liquid called the rinse. Verberg argues that Bochet was originally a thrifty second-tier beverage made from these honeycomb washings and not pristine honey. When viewed this way, the famous long, intense boil from our 600-year-old recipe takes on a whole new meaning. It wasn't an artistic flavor choice, it was a vital purification process. So first, boiling melted the residual wax and hive debris, so they floated up to the top, allowing the brewer to skim away the scum and clarify the liquid. Second, low-grade medieval honey likely tasted pretty bitter and animalistic. Boiling it down completely masked those off flavors, replacing them with universal notes of burnt sugar, toffee, and smoke. Most importantly, Verberg's etymological research tracks the word bochet back to 1292, proving that bochet is linguistically tied to old terms for beekeeper. So historically then, Bochet wasn't a luxury dessert wine. It was simply the beekeeper's drink, a functional, everyday farmhouse beverage born entirely from a waste stream. Okay, so bringing it all together here. While the 14th century French recipe is the earliest known explicit one for Bochet, it is far from the only historical reference to the term. We now know that Bochet did not exclusively mean a mead made from caramelized honey, and for centuries was used more broadly as a regional term for mead, and in some cases, specifically for a beekeeper's drink. Historical records also reveal that the meaning evolved over time, appearing in legal documents, encyclopedias, and even medical texts. And by the 17th and 18th centuries, French medical writings had transformed Bochet into something entirely different, a medicinal sweat-inducing beverage made by boiling water with sugar, cinnamon, and various medicinal roots or woods, often without any honey at all. So with all of this excellent work and research in recent years, we should now think of the Bochet as having many different personalities over the French medieval era, from the drink of the beekeeper to an everyday quaff for the middle class, to one of the many names of honey wine, and finally, something more medicinal in nature. Whatever the iterations and evolutions it experienced, the Bochet clearly made an impact. It's so amazing to think that making a Bochet is actually a very new thing to homebrewing, despite it coming from such an old recipe. It immediately sparked a massive resurgence across online homebrewing platforms like Got Mead and Homebrew Talk. So what really started as an experimental attempt to recreate a lost burnt honey drink quickly transformed into a celebrated mainstream craft style within the modern mead-making renaissance. Today, modern mazers define a Bochet as any mead where the honey portion of the must has been intentionally cooked, caramelized, or charred prior to dilution and fermentation. Modern craft discussions typically focus on three things. The first is safety. Because honey lacks water, its boiling point can soar past 150 Celsius or 300 Fahrenheit. And at this threshold, it violently expands up to 5 times its original volume. And a lot of homebrewers call this explosion hot honey lava. So industry guidelines kind of suggest you try to wear glasses or long sleeves when you're making it, and definitely use a pot at least 5 times larger than your honey volume. Next is the color gradient, which is super cool. Much like roasting barley for beer, the duration of the cook dictates the flavor profile. If you want something that's light amber or gold, you're going to cook for 10 to 15 minutes, and this will introduce delicate culinary caramel and marshmallow notes. If you want something a little darker, like copper or ruby, you're going to go 20 to 30 minutes, and you're going to get flavors of toasted marshmallow, rich toffee, or soft oak. And if you really want to go the distance here and you want that black, dark mahogany color, you're going to go for 45 minutes or longer. And this is going to push the boundaries into bitter notes of dark chocolate, espresso, and campfire smoke. The final pillar is structural blending. Because bone-dry Bochets can be very intense and a little polarizing, Oftentimes, brewers will lean into hybrid styles to balance the harsh smoke. Bochet mills introduce highly acidic fruits like raspberries or sour cherries, while Bochet sizers dilute the honey with tart apple cider. And this can sometimes mimic a caramel apple, which sounds incredible. I need to try this. And because every batch of honey can taste a little different, so too will a Bochet. Regardless of where you start or finish, the fruits, spices, or botanicals you add, each blend has a uniqueness and a one-of-a-kind outcome that truly makes Bochets a treat and jewel of every Mazer's Mead collection. This versatile style has exploded online, popularized by channels like Doing the Most, Man-Made Mead, Golden Hive Mead, and Tasting History, and so many others, so go check them out and watch them all. This viral footprint has pushed Bochet into 3 major arenas. From beginning purely as a homebrew oddity, it has actually moved into a lot of commercial lineups as a premium mead offering. It also dominates homebrew forums where makers swap alternative methods like using slow cookers or pressure cookers. And it also thrives in the competition circuits like the Mazer Cup, where it regularly steals the spotlight in specialty and historical categories. And so, what better way to revive and relive a bit of history than actually making it today? Let's get into it. When making a medieval mead, it sure helps to dress the part. Here's the recipe that I'm going to be following today. And the goal here was to try to stay as close to that 1393 recipe as possible. Based upon this recipe, it's likely our mead will finish out around 5% ABV or a little lower. To cook our honey today, I have dug out ye old hot plate. And it did the job just wonderfully. I don't have a cauldron, so a cast iron Dutch oven that has seen better days will do. You can see that my honey has crystallized, but because we're cooking it, it melts down no problem. A note on safety. So we've got some trivets and some safety gloves. Polyester sleeves are no good for Bochet making. I also found some excellent eyewear. Alright, so we're almost at the 5-minute mark here. Things are moving along pretty quickly, and now we're getting some foam on the top of the surface. You can see that it started to boil. Between 5 and 10 minutes, there's a good amount of foam on the surface, and now you can see that it's starting to turn color. It's rolling vigorously, and there's quite a lot of steam. It's super hot at this point. We're at about 10 minutes here, and now 15. And now we're at 20. I ended here. This is somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes, and you can see that it's a nice copper color. Sleeves down. Here is the caramelization time lapse. We have 5 minutes, 10, 15, 20, and 25 to 30. Now that it's started to cool, the foam has come down, and here's my heated water that I'm going to be adding. This was about 12 cups in total, and I made sure to stir after every couple additions. It's important to stir everything until the honey is dissolved completely and everything is mixed. I put the lid on it and left it to cool overnight. The next day, we're ready to make our mead. Token cat for luck. This is the cup that I will be rehydrating our yeast in. The yeast that we're using today is Saf Ale SO4. It's a great ale yeast, and again, I think a good candidate for a Bochet. And we'll just rehydrate there with a couple ounces of spring water. I decided to simply use a piece of cheesecloth for my spice bag. Here are my cloves, my seeds of paradise, and my elderberries. I'm making a 1-gallon batch, so here's my carboy and my funnel. I thought it might be easiest to strain the liquid through the cheesecloth with the spices. However, everything got plugged up, so unfortunately I had to amend things slightly. I chose to keep the spice bag in the funnel, which allowed the liquid to flow through, but still came into contact with the spices. This was a compromise that I think worked well. I had to top off my spring water a little bit by adding an extra 2 cups. I gave it a good stir, pushed the spice bag in. Now we're adding our rehydrated yeast, stirring again, and closing everything off with an airlock. And then we leave it for a month and see what happens. As suggested in the recipe, I'll be sure to take the spice bag out after 3 days so that the Bochet's flavors don't get too intense. Okay, a few footnotes here. Because this was an attempt to replicate a medieval recipe, I really tried to avoid using any of my modern equipment or even brewing science. That means no hydrometer to check our initial gravity or nutrient additions to support the yeast activities. Whether it stalls or finishes out, it'll be fun to try anyways. Thanks for joining me on this medieval mead adventure. It is so incredible to think that a simple recipe written out more than 600 years ago would centuries later ignite a global brewing phenomenon. What started as probably a rustic fireside household chore has transformed into one of the most exciting experimental frontiers in the modern mead universe. And it really proves that sometimes looking deep into the past can inspire us to chart the future. So, if you're ready to risk a little honey lava in the kitchen, grab a pot, pick your favorite medieval-inspired spices, and try your hand at this 14th century brew. And may mead be on your table.